The mammoth's tusk had torn through Grok's side like lightning split spark, leaving a gaping wound that painted the cave floor crimson. His massive frame, once capable of wrestling bears and leading hunts across frozen valleys, now trembled against the cold stone wall. Each labored breath sent steam rising from his lips into the frigid air of their mountain shelter. The metallic scent of blood mixed with smoke from their dying fire, creating an atmosphere thick with impending doom. Nara knelt beside him, her thick fingers pressing moss and animal hide against the bleeding gash. Her broad shoulders blocked the dim firelight, casting shadows across Grok's weathered face. At 32 winters, she had survived more than most, buried 2 mates, raised orphaned young, and earned respect through strength rather than submission. Her heavy brow furrowed as she watched life drain from the band's leader, the man who had guided them through countless dangers and bitter seasons. "The mammoth," Grok wheezed, his powerful hand gripping her wrist with surprising force. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, dark and thick in the firelight. "Did we bring it down?" "Kyle and Roth finished it," Nara replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Behind her, the other members of their hunter-gatherer band huddled near the fire, 12 souls who had followed Grok through 3 harsh seasons, their faces painted with a mixture of grief and terror. There will be meat for many days, enough to last until the thaw. But they both knew meat meant nothing if leadership crumbled with winter's approach. The cave walls, worn smooth by countless generations of their kind, seemed to press closer, as if the mountain itself sensed the coming crisis. Ice had already begun forming at the cave entrance, and the howling wind outside promised a winter more brutal than any in living memory. The cave echoed with nervous murmurs and the scraping of feet on stone. Young Kyle, barely 18 and still bearing the lean build of inexperience, paced near the entrance like a caged predator. His dark eyes darted between the dying alpha and the assembled group, uncertainty written across his angular features. The orphan had lost his parents to a rock slide 3 seasons ago, and Grok had taken him in, taught him to track and hunt. Now his mentor lay dying, leaving him adrift in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or leaderless. Vera, clutching her infant son against her chest, rocked silently by the fire pit. The child's father had been taken by wolves 2 moons ago, leaving her alone to face the coming cold with only milk in her breasts and desperation in her heart. Her eyes, red from smoke and tears, watched Grok's labored breathing with the intensity of someone who understood that his death might seal her own fate and that of her child. Roth limped deeper into the cave, his own leg bloodied from the hunt that had claimed their leader. The scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, a reminder of a cave bear encounter from his youth, seemed more prominent in the flickering light. At 28, he was strong enough to challenge for leadership, his muscles still corded with the power needed to bring down large prey. But his injured leg would heal slowly, and winter would not wait for his recovery. "The wind grows colder," whispered Finn, the eldest among them at 54 winters. His gnarled hands tended the fire with practiced ease, feeding it scraps of dried wood and mammoth dung collected over months of careful preparation. Years of tending flames had left his fingers permanently stained with soot, but his knowledge of weather patterns and seasonal changes had kept them alive when other bands perished in the frozen darkness. "The ice season comes early this year. I feel it in my bones." The old firekeeper's words sent ripples of unease through the group. If Finn, who had survived more winters than any 2 of them combined, spoke of early ice, then death might already be scratching at their cave entrance with frozen claws. Grok's breathing grew shallower, each exhalation weaker than the last. He pulled Nara closer with trembling fingers, his breath hot against her ear despite the cold that was slowly claiming his massive body. The band needs strength to survive the ice season. They need someone who has faced death and walked away, someone who knows the weight of loss. His eyes, once fierce as a cornered predator defending its young, now held the desperation of a leader who understood his time had ended. Around them, the cave walls bore the scratches and paintings of their ancestors, crude images of hunts, storms, and survival that stretched back through generations of struggle. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward toward the smoke-stained ceiling where countless others had sought refuge from the merciless world outside. "You want me to lead them?" Nara said, not asking but stating the truth she saw in his fading gaze. Her voice carried no surprise, only the heavy understanding of someone who had always known this moment might come. Grok nodded weakly, his grip tightening on her thick wrist. "Take my place. Guide them through the darkness ahead. You are stronger than any of them know." The request hung in the cold air like morning frost, visible and shocking in its implications. In their world, leadership belonged to the strongest male, the best hunter, the fiercest fighter, yet here lay their alpha, choosing a female whose strength came not from conquest but from endurance, a woman who had outlasted blizzards, starvation, and loss itself. The decision would shake the very foundations of how their band understood power and survival. Nara's silence stretched like the moments before lightning strikes. The cave held its breath, 12 pairs of eyes watching as she processed Grok's unprecedented request. Her calloused fingers, still pressed against his wound, felt the last warmth leaving his massive body. The fire behind her cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the ancient cave paintings seem to move, hunters and prey locked in eternal struggle, just as her band now faced their own battle for survival. "I am not a hunter," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that howled through cracks in the stone. "I do not lead raids or track mammoth herds across the frozen plains." Grok's eyes flickered with the last vestiges of his strength. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth as he spoke, each word a struggle. "You are something more valuable. You are a survivor. When the great sickness took half our band 3 winters ago, who kept the rest alive? When the river flooded our old cave and we lost everything, who found this shelter?" His grip on her wrist tightened desperately. "Leadership is not about the hunt, Nara. It is about keeping the flame alive when darkness comes." Behind them, the band stirred uneasily. Kyle stopped his pacing and moved closer, his young face twisted with confusion and something that might have been anger. "A female cannot lead," he said, his voice cracking with emotion and youth. "It is not the way. My father led before the rocks took him. Grok led after. A strong male must lead." Roth pushed himself up from where he sat, nursing his injured leg, his scarred face hard as winter stone. "The boy speaks truth," he growled, pain making his voice sharper than usual. "I am wounded but not broken. When my leg heals, I can take Grok's place. The band knows me, trusts my strength." Vera clutched her infant closer, the child whimpering softly against her chest. "And what happens if you fall in the next hunt, Roth? What if the cave bear finds you before your leg mends? Do we wait for death while you prove your worth?" Her voice carried the bitter wisdom of a woman who had already lost everything once. "At least Nara has kept us fed when the hunters came back empty-handed. She knows where to find roots beneath the snow, which berries won't poison the children." The firelight revealed the deep lines etched around Finn's eyes, as the old man studied the dying alpha and the woman beside him. His weathered hands never stopped feeding the flames, a lifetime of habit that had kept countless nights at bay. "In the old days, before my grandfather's time, there were bands led by the mother bears, strong females who protected their young when the males fell to predators." His voice carried the weight of ancient memories passed down through generations. "Perhaps Grok sees something we have forgotten." "Old stories," Kyle spat, his adolescent pride wounded by the suggestion that tradition might bend. "We are not our grandfathers. We are stronger, better hunters. We do not need to follow the ways of the weak." Nara felt Grok's breathing become even more labored, felt his life ebbing away with each heartbeat. Around her, the argument continued, voices rising and falling like the wind outside. But beneath their words, she heard something else: fear. Raw, primitive terror at the thought of facing winter without strong leadership. They were right to be afraid. The mountains showed no mercy to the leaderless, and the ice season was already reaching icy fingers toward their refuge. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the debate like a stone axe through hide. The cave fell silent except for the crackling of flames and Grok's rattling breaths. "Grok chose me not because I'm female or male, but because he believes I can keep you alive. That is all that matters when the cold comes." She looked around the circle of faces, seeing doubt, hope, anger, and desperation reflected in equal measure. "You want proof of strength? I have buried 2 mates and still draw breath. I have pulled children from floodwaters, while grown hunters stood frozen with fear. I have walked alone into blizzards to find food when our stores ran low, and I returned every time." Kyle's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. "But can you kill a cave bear that threatens the band? Can you face down rival hunters who want our territory? Can you lead us in the great hunts that will feed us through the dark months?" Before Nara could answer, Grok used his last strength to lift his head slightly, his eyes burning with fierce intensity. "She will do what must be done," he gasped, "or you will all die in the ice." His head fell back against the stone with a hollow sound that seemed to echo through their bones. The silence that followed stretched like a taut sinew ready to snap. Every member of the band understood that they stood at a crossroads: follow an untested female leader, or face the chaos of a power struggle while winter closed its jaws around them. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks toward the darkness above, each tiny light a reminder of how fragile their survival truly was. Nara felt the weight of their stares, felt the enormity of what Grok was asking her to shoulder. Leading meant making choices that could save or damn them all. It meant being the one others blamed when things went wrong, the one who decided who got the last of the food when hunger came calling. It meant becoming the barrier between her people and the countless ways the world wanted to kill them. "I accept," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning within her chest. "If this is Grok's wish, if this is what the band needs, then I will carry this burden." The Alpha's lips curved into something that might have been a smile as his eyes closed for the final time, his massive frame growing still against the cave wall that had sheltered their kind for generations uncounted. The moment Grok's final breath escaped his lips, something primal and terrible erupted from the depths of the cave. Vera threw back her head and released a wail that seemed to come from the very core of her being, a sound of loss so raw and ancient that it spoke to every creature that had ever mourned. Her infant, startled by the sudden noise, added his own terrified screams to the growing cacophony. Kael's grief transformed into rage, his young voice cracking as he bellowed his fury at the stone walls. His fists struck the cave floor until his knuckles bled, the sound of flesh against rock mixing with his wordless cries. The orphan boy who had lost parents, then mentor, poured out his fear and abandonment in sounds that barely seemed human. Even Roth, scarred and hardened by years of brutal survival, could not contain the roar that tore from his throat. His wounded leg forgotten, he pulled himself upright and added his voice to the others. His battle-worn face twisted with an anguish that spoke of bonds forged in blood and shared hardship. The sound echoed off the cave walls, multiplying and growing until it seemed as though the mountain itself was screaming. Finn's weathered hands trembled as he threw dried grass and twigs onto the fire, making it flare brighter in honor of their fallen leader. His own voice joined the chorus, not a scream but a low, mournful chant that his grandfather had taught him, words in the old tongue that were meant to guide spirits to their rest. The ancient syllables wove between the other cries like smoke, adding depth to their collective lament. Nara remained silent beside Grok's still form, her broad shoulders shaking not with grief alone, but with the overwhelming weight of what she had just accepted. The screams of her people washed over her like a physical force, and she understood that this was more than mourning. This was the sound of a pack recognizing the death of their alpha, the primal acknowledgement that their world had fundamentally changed. The others joined in gradually, each adding their voice to the growing storm of sound. Young mothers clutched children who wailed in confusion and terror. The few adolescents among them screamed with the fury of creatures who sensed danger, but could not understand its source. Even the youngest children, too small to comprehend death, cried because the adults around them had filled the air with fear and sorrow. Outside the cave, the wind picked up their cries and carried them across the frozen landscape. Any predator within miles would hear their grief, would know that something had shifted in the territory of the Greystone Band. Rival hunter-gatherer groups would mark the sounds and remember them. Weakness was always noted in their harsh world, filed away for future use when resources grew scarce and territories needed expanding. The screaming continued for long minutes that felt like hours, primal sounds that had no words, because no language could contain the complexity of their emotions. These were the voices of creatures balanced on the knife's edge between civilization and wilderness, beings who had learned to make tools and control fire, but who still understood that death was the great equalizer, the force that reminded them how fragile their grip on existence truly was. Gradually, exhaustion began to quiet the voices one by one. Vera's wails became sobs as she rocked her child, her body drained by the outpouring of emotion. Kael's roars faded to harsh breathing as he slumped against the cave wall, his bloody knuckles testament to his pain. Roth settled back onto his injured leg, his scarred face wet with tears he made no effort to hide. When the last echo died away, the silence that followed was somehow more terrible than the screaming had been. It was the quiet of endings, of recognition, that nothing would ever be the same again. The fire crackled in the stillness, its light dancing across faces marked by grief and uncertainty. Nara finally moved, her thick fingers closing Grok's sightless eyes with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with her powerful frame. "We must prepare him properly," she said. her voice hoarse despite not having joined the screaming. "He deserves the honor of a true leader's farewell. Who are you to decide how we honor him?" Kyle's voice was raw, stripped of its earlier fury, but still carrying defiance. "You are not our leader yet. Grok may have spoken, but the band has not chosen." Nara turned to face the young man, her eyes reflecting the firelight like those of a predator caught in flame. "Then choose now," she said simply. "Choose who will lead you through the ice season. Choose who will decide when to hunt and when to hide. Who gets the last of the food when hunger comes. Who will stand between you and death when the cave bears wake from their sleep." The challenge hung in the air, like smoke from the fire. Around the cave, the survivors of their recent screaming looked at each other with the dawning realization that grief was a luxury they could not afford for long. Outside, winter was gathering its strength for the assault that would test every decision, every alliance, every ounce of strength they possessed. Roth struggled to his feet again, favoring his wounded leg, but standing as straight as his injuries allowed. "I can lead," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction his words required. When your leg heals, the snow may already be too deep for hunting," Vera interrupted, her voice steadier now that her child had quieted. "When your leg heals, the mammoth herds may have moved beyond our reach. We need strength now, not promises of future strength." Finn fed more fuel to the fire, his ancient eyes studying each face in the flickering light. "The ice speaks to me in dreams," he said quietly. "This winter will be harder than any in my lifetime. We will need every kind of strength to survive it. The strength to hunt, yes, but also the strength to endure, to adapt, to keep hope alive when death seems certain." The old firekeeper's words settled over them like a blanket, heavy with the wisdom of someone who had seen too many winters, too many deaths, too many bands that had failed to adapt when the world demanded change. In his weathered face, they could see the reflection of their own mortality, the understanding that survival was never guaranteed and always required sacrifice. As if summoned by their moment of vulnerability, a long howl echoed across the mountainside, the voice of a wolf pack announcing their presence to the world. The sound sent chills through the cave that had nothing to do with the cold air, reminding them all that predators were always listening, always waiting for weakness to reveal itself. The wolf howl had barely faded when Nara made her first decision as leader. She stood slowly, her powerful frame casting long shadows in the firelight as she surveyed the cave entrance where ice crystals were already beginning to form. "Kale, Roth, take 2 others and drag the mammoth carcass closer to the cave. The wolves smell blood and they're gathering courage. We cannot afford to lose that meat to scavengers." Kyle's dark eyes flashed with rebellious fire. "You give orders like you have already won our loyalty, but Grok's death does not make you our alpha." He gestured toward Roth, whose scarred face remained stoic despite the pain in his wounded leg. "Roth has proven himself in battle. His scars speak of courage and strength. My scars speak of survival," Roth said quietly, surprising everyone by not immediately supporting the young man's challenge. "But they also speak of times when courage was not enough, when strength failed, when survival required different qualities." He limped closer to Nara, his eyes studying her face in the flickering light. "What happens when we face enemies who cannot be fought? When winter brings starvation, and the choice becomes who lives and who dies?" Nara met his gaze steadily. "Then I make the choice that keeps the most of us alive, even if it damns my own soul in the process. That is what leadership means, carrying the weight of decisions others cannot bear to make." A younger woman named Farah, barely past her first bleeding, stepped forward from the shadows near the back of the cave. Her thin frame spoke of too many hungry seasons, but her eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had seen too much death. "My mother followed Grok because he kept us fed. My father followed him because he led successful hunts. I will follow whoever can keep my baby sister alive through the ice season." She glanced toward a small child sleeping fitfully near the fire. "Words mean nothing when children starve." The pragmatism in Thara's voice cut through the philosophical debate like a flint knife through hide. Around the cave, other voices began to murmur agreement, not necessarily with Nara's leadership, but with the urgent need to make decisions before circumstances made them irrelevant. Finn rose from his position by the fire, his ancient joints creaking audibly in the cold air. "The mammoth will freeze solid if we leave it outside much longer," he observed, with the practical wisdom of someone who had survived 54 brutal winters. "Frozen meat is harder to cut, harder to preserve. We need that carcass processed before the deep cold comes." Vera shifted her infant to her other arm, the child's small fists waving weakly in the firelight. And what of Grok's body? Do we leave him to freeze as well while we argue about who deserves to command? Her voice carried the sharp edge of a mother's pragmatism. He was our leader, our protector. He deserves the honor of proper preparation. The reminder of Grok's still form brought a moment of shameful silence to the cave. In their grief and power struggle, they had nearly forgotten the most basic obligation to their fallen leader. Even in death, he commanded respect that none of them had yet earned from the others. Nara nodded slowly, acknowledging both the wisdom in Vera's words and the test they presented. Finn, can you prepare Grok's body according to the old ways? You know the rituals better than any of us. The firekeeper's weathered face creased with what might have been approval. I know the words and the methods, but the preparation requires help. The body must be cleaned, wrapped in the best hides, positioned properly for the journey to the ancestor grounds. I will help, offered a middle-aged hunter named Brack, whose steady hands had fashioned some of their finest tools. Grok taught me to read the tracks of elk and bear. I owe him that much. Kyle's jaw tightened with frustration as he watched others begin to accept Nara's authority, even if reluctantly. Fine, but I will not pretend to follow orders from someone who has never led a hunt, never faced down a charging mammoth, never felt the weight of life and death decisions in battle. Then prove your worthiness to lead instead of complaining about mine, Nara replied calmly. Take Roth and whoever will follow you. Bring back the mammoth meat before the wolves claim it. Show the band that you can protect what is ours. The challenge was cleverly laid. It gave Kale a chance to demonstrate leadership, while also serving the practical need to secure their food supply. Roth understood the subtlety and nodded approvingly, despite his earlier questions about female leadership. I can walk well enough for this task, Roth declared, testing his weight on his injured leg. The wound is deep, but the bone is whole, and the boy is right that he has shown courage in the hunt. Let us see if courage translates to leadership. Kale's pride flared at being called boy, but the opportunity to prove himself was too tempting to refuse. Who among you will come with us to face whatever predators gather around our kill? His young voice carried across the cave, seeking supporters among the band. 3 of the younger hunters responded, men and women who had grown up following Kyle on expeditions to gather eggs, track small game, and explore the mountain valleys. Their loyalty to him ran deeper than political calculations. They had shared the bonds forged in the dangerous work of survival. As the volunteer group prepared to venture back into the frozen night, Nara felt the weight of leadership settling more heavily on her shoulders. If they succeeded in retrieving the mammoth meat, Kyle would gain prestige and support for his eventual challenge. If they failed, or if some were injured or killed, the blame would fall on her for sending them out in dangerous conditions. But the alternative, allowing their main food source to be devoured by scavengers, was not acceptable. Leadership meant making decisions where every choice carried risks, where success and failure often depended on factors beyond any leader's control. Outside the cave, another wolf howl rose into the night sky, closer this time, and answered by others from different directions. The pack was indeed gathering, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of an easy meal. Time was running short, and the luxury of extended debate was slipping away with each passing moment. The bitter wind cut through their hide wrappings like claws as Kyle led the retrieval party into the frozen darkness beyond the cave. Behind them, the warm glow of their fire became a distant memory, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the mountain night. Roth limped alongside him, his injured leg leaving an uneven trail in the snow, while the 3 younger hunters, Dara, Morg, and Jek, clutched their crude spears with hands that trembled from cold and fear. The mammoth carcass lay where they had left it, a massive dark shape against the white landscape, but it was no longer alone. Yellow eyes reflected their torchlight from multiple directions, and the low growls that emerged from the darkness spoke of a pack much larger than they had anticipated. At least 8 wolves circled the fallen giant, their lean forms moving like shadows made flesh. Too many, whispered Dara, the youngest of the group at barely 16 winters. Her breath came in rapid puffs that instantly froze in the air, and her knuckles were white where she gripped her spear. We should go back, wait for daylight when they might retreat. Kyle's jaw tightened with the stubborn pride of youth refusing to admit defeat. Daylight is hours away, and more scavengers will come by then, bears perhaps, or rival bands who have also caught the scent. He raised his torch higher, causing the wolves to shift nervously but not retreat. We take what is ours by right of the kill. Roth studied the scene with the calculating eye of experience. weighing risks against rewards with the cold logic of someone who had survived many such encounters. The wolves were hungry, but not desperate, yet. They could be driven off if the approach was careful, methodical. But Cale's impatience was a dangerous variable in an already volatile situation. "The alpha female," Roth said quietly, pointing to a particularly large wolf whose silver-grey coat marked her as the pack leader. "She stands between us, and the choice cuts we need most. Drive her back and the others will follow." Morg, a sturdy hunter with arms thickened by years of throwing spears, hefted a stone in his free hand. "I can strike her from here. One good throw to the skull." "No," Kyle commanded, his voice carrying the authority he craved to wield over the band. "We need the meat, not a battle with wounded wolves. We advance slowly, use fire and noise to claim what belongs to us." But as they began their careful approach, something went wrong. Jack, nervous and inexperienced, stumbled over a hidden root and fell heavily into the snow. His torch flew from his grasp and landed near the mammoth's head, sputtering and threatening to die in the wet snow. The sudden movement and the loss of light emboldened the pack, and the alpha female charged with a snarl that echoed across the mountainside. Kyle threw himself forward to meet the attack, his spear aimed at the wolf's chest, but his footing on the icy ground was uncertain. The weapon deflected off the creature's thick winter coat, and suddenly 60 pounds of muscle, teeth, and fury was bearing down on him. He managed to get his arm up in time to prevent the wolf's jaws from closing on his throat, but her fangs sank deep into the meat of his forearm, sending hot blood streaming onto the snow. Roth moved as quickly as his injured leg would allow, driving his own spear toward the wolf's flank. But the wound in his thigh betrayed him at the crucial moment, buckling under the strain and sending him sprawling. The alpha female, sensing weakness, released Kyle and turned toward the fallen hunter with predatory intelligence gleaming in her yellow eyes. Nara screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a blade. But in her fear, she found unexpected courage, lunging forward with her spear to place herself between the wolf and Roth. The point caught the alpha female in the shoulder, a glancing blow that drew blood, but failed to stop her charge. The battle that followed was brief but brutal. Morg managed to retrieve Jack's fallen torch while the young man scrambled to his feet, but the light revealed a scene of chaos. Blood stained the snow in dark patches, both human and wolf. Kyle clutched his torn arm against his chest, his face pale with pain and shock. Roth lay on his side, favoring his wounded leg, while trying to stanch a new gash across his ribs, where the alpha's claws had found their mark. The wolves, faced with determined resistance and the return of fire, finally retreated into the darkness beyond the torchlight. But their eyes still gleamed from the shadows, and their occasional growls made it clear they had not given up their claim to the mammoth entirely. The pack was simply waiting, watching for another moment of weakness to exploit. "We cannot stay here," Roth gasped, his breathing labored from pain and exertion. "More blood in the snow will bring other predators. Cave bears, perhaps, or worse." Kyle looked at the massive mammoth carcass, then at his wounded companions, and felt the bitter taste of failure in his mouth. They had come to prove their strength, to demonstrate leadership, and instead had been driven back by scavengers. The meat they desperately needed remained largely undefended, but they lacked the numbers and strength to claim it properly. "We take what we can carry," he decided, his voice tight with pain and frustration. "Cut away portions from the belly and flanks, the easiest pieces to transport quickly. Leave the rest for now." Working with desperate efficiency, they carved chunks of meat from the massive carcass, while the wolves paced impatiently in the surrounding darkness. Every few minutes, one of the predators would test their resolve with a fainting charge, forcing them to abandon their butchering to present a united front with spears and fire. The work was exhausting under the best circumstances, but with 2 wounded members and the constant threat of attack, it became a nightmare of endurance and will. By the time they had gathered what they could safely transport, all 5 hunters were bloodied, exhausted, and demoralized. The journey back to the cave was a stumbling retreat through snow that seemed determined to drag them down with every step. Cale's wounded arm made carrying meat difficult, while Roth's leg injury forced him to lean heavily on Morg for support. Behind them, the wolves followed at a respectful distance, waiting for someone to fall, for weakness to provide them with an easier meal than the frozen mammoth. When they finally reached the cave entrance, their torches guttering and their strength nearly gone, Nara was waiting for them in the opening. Her eyes took in their wounds, their exhaustion, the pitifully small amount of meat they had managed to retrieve, and her expression remained carefully neutral. The wolves proved stronger than expected, Kyle admitted through gritted teeth, his pride as wounded as his arm. We could not claim the full carcass without greater numbers. Nara nodded, showing no satisfaction at his failure, no criticism for the attempt. Finn, tend to their wounds. Vera, help me examine what meat they have brought. She looked directly at Kale, her voice carrying neither condemnation nor false praise. You fought bravely and brought back what you could. That takes courage, even if it was not complete success. The acknowledgement stung worse than outright criticism would have. Kyle had set out to prove his worthiness to lead, to show that traditional male strength was superior to whatever Nara offered. Instead, he had demonstrated the limitations of courage without wisdom, of pride without proper preparation. Dawn brought no relief from the bitter cold that had settled over their mountain refuge, like a living thing with claws of ice. The weak sunlight barely penetrated the clouds that promised more snow, and the wind carried the distant howls of the wolf pack that still claimed their mammoth carcass. Inside the cave, the atmosphere was thick with tension, pain, and the growing realization that their food supplies were far from adequate for the long winter ahead. Finn worked over Kyle's wounded arm, with the methodical patience of someone who had tended countless injuries over 5 decades of survival. The old firekeeper's gnarled fingers probed the puncture wounds left by the alpha female's fangs, cleaning them with water heated over the fire and packing them with moss and crushed herbs that would prevent the rot that killed more hunters than any predator. The wounds are deep but clean, Finn announced, his voice carrying the authority of experience. The wolf's teeth missed the great blood vessels, but the arm will be weak for many days. No heavy lifting, no throwing spears with power. You are fortunate the beast did not shake her head while biting. That would have torn the meat from bone. Kyle gritted his teeth against the pain as the old man wrapped his arm with strips of hide, his face pale but determined not to show weakness before the band. The failed retrieval mission had cost him more than blood. It had damaged his standing among those who might have supported his claim to leadership. Now he sat diminished, dependent on others for healing, while the woman he had challenged tended to the practical matters that would keep them alive. Roth fared little better. The gash across his ribs, combined with his earlier leg wound, left him unable to walk without assistance. Vera had fashioned a crude crutch from a broken spear shaft, but every movement sent waves of pain across his scarred features. The mighty hunter, who had dreamed of leading the band, was reduced to sitting by the fire like an elder, watching others make the decisions that survival demanded. Nara stood at the cave entrance, her broad frame silhouetted against the grey morning light as she studied the landscape beyond. The meat Kyle's group had retrieved would feed them for perhaps 3 days, if carefully rationed. But winter stretched ahead like a vast enemy army, patient and inexorable in its advance. She had to make decisions that would determine who lived and who died, choices that would haunt her for whatever remained of her life. We cannot survive on what little meat remains, she said, turning back to address the band. Her voice carried neither panic nor false optimism, just the stark honesty of someone who understood their situation completely. The mammoth carcass is lost to us unless we can drive off the entire wolf pack, and we lack the numbers for such a battle. We must find other sources of food. Thara, the young woman whose pragmatism had impressed others during the leadership debate, rose from where she had been tending her sleeping sister. The winter roots I know are buried deep under snow now, but some might still be found near the hot springs 2 valleys over. The ground there stays softer longer into the cold season. That is a day's journey each way, observed Brack, the toolmaker who had volunteered to help prepare Grok's body. 3 days total for a search that might yield nothing. Can we afford to send hunters away for so long when predators circle our territory? Dara, still shaken from the previous night's encounter with the wolves, wrapped her thin arms around her knees as she spoke. What if we encounter other bands near the hot springs? The warm ground draws many groups when the ice comes early. They might not welcome competitors for the same resources. The questions hung in the cold air like icicles waiting to fall. Every potential solution carried risks that could prove fatal, yet doing nothing guaranteed slow starvation as their meager supplies dwindled. Nara felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her shoulders like a stone, the responsibility for 12 lives that looked to her for answers she did not possess. Vera shifted her infant to her other arm, the child's small movements a reminder of the most vulnerable among them. My milk grows thin when I do not eat enough, she said quietly. If I cannot feed my son, he will die within days. The choice is not whether to take risks, but which risks offer the best hope of survival. Finn looked up from his work on Kyle's arm, his ancient eyes reflecting decades of hard-won wisdom. In my grandfather's time, there was a winter so harsh that 3 bands joined together to share resources and knowledge. They put aside territorial disputes because survival demanded cooperation instead of competition. Join with other bands? Kyle's voice cracked with indignation despite his weakened state. Share our hunting grounds with strangers who might cut our throats in the night for a handful of meat. That is not survival. That is madness. What hunting grounds? Nara asked pointedly. The mammoth that could have fed us for a moon is being devoured by wolves. Our territory extends only as far as we can defend it, and with 2 wounded hunters, our ability to defend anything has been greatly reduced. The brutal honesty of her words sent uncomfortable murmurs through the band. They had grown accustomed to thinking of themselves as masters of their domain, but the reality was far more precarious. Their strength lay not in dominance but in adaptability, not in conquest but in the wisdom to recognize when circumstances demanded humility. Morg, who had fought alongside Kale against the wolves, cleared his throat nervously before speaking. I know the location of 2 other bands that shelter within a day's walk of here. The Redstone people have a larger cave system, but fewer hunters. The River Bend band has skilled fishers but little meat. Either group might welcome an alliance, Thara added thoughtfully, especially if we can offer them something they need in exchange for what we lack. Finn's knowledge of firekeeping is valuable to any band, and Brack's tool-making skills could trade for winter stores. Nara nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in the suggestion even as she recognized the dangers it entailed. Approaching other bands for alliance meant admitting weakness, revealing desperation that could be exploited, but it also offered the possibility of combining strengths to overcome challenges that none could face alone. There is another consideration, Roth said from his position near the fire, his voice heavy with pain but clear in its logic. If we delay much longer, the deep snow will make travel between bands impossible. The window for forming alliances closes with each storm that passes. Outside the cave, the wind picked up strength, howling through the mountain passes with a sound like angry spirits. The temperature was dropping even as they spoke, and ice crystals began forming on the cave walls despite the warmth from their fire. Winter was tightening its grip with each passing hour, transforming their world into a frozen wasteland where only the prepared and the lucky would survive. Nara made her decision with the same decisive finality that had marked her acceptance of Grok's final request. Thara, Morg, you will come with me to the Redstone people at first light tomorrow. We will seek alliance based on mutual benefit, not from desperation alone. Finn, you will remain here with the wounded and the children, keeping the fire alive and the cave secure. And if the Redstone people refuse your offer? Kyle asked, his wounded arm cradled against his chest. If they see us as competitors rather than potential allies? Then we try the River Bend band, Nara replied simply. And if they also refuse, we return here and face whatever comes with the strength we have left. But we will not die without trying every option that wisdom can devise. The journey to the Redstone band's territory began before dawn, when the frozen world lay shrouded in grey mist that turned familiar landmarks into ghostly phantoms. Nara led the small diplomatic party through snow that crunched beneath their feet like broken bones, each step a calculated risk that took them farther from the safety of their cave and deeper into uncertainty. Behind her, Thara and Morg followed in single file, their breaths creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. The Redstone people had earned their name from the distinctive ochre cliffs that sheltered their cave system, natural formations that glowed like dried blood when the sun touched them at the right angle. Their territory bordered a stream that rarely froze completely, providing access to fresh water even in the deepest winter, a resource that made them valuable allies or dangerous enemies, depending on circumstances and diplomacy. As they approached the familiar landmarks that marked the boundary between territories, Nara felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. This mission would either secure their band's survival through the coming winter or mark her first major failure as leader. The stakes could not be higher, and there would be no second chances if she misjudged the situation. "Smoke ahead," Morg whispered, pointing toward a thin grey column rising from behind the red cliffs. "They are awake and tending their fires. That is good. It means we will not surprise them unprepared." Surprising another band without proper warning was often interpreted as an act of aggression, a prelude to raid or attack. The protocols for peaceful contact were ancient and essential, evolved over countless generations of tentative cooperation between groups that might become allies or enemies, depending on the season's needs and the personalities of their leaders. Thara cupped her hands around her mouth and released the traditional call for parley, a complex series of sounds that identified their band, declared peaceful intent, and requested permission to approach. The call echoed off the cliff faces, multiplying and distorting until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. They waited in tense silence for a response that would determine whether their mission could proceed or whether they would be turned away without negotiation. The answer came after long minutes that stretched like hours, a different call that granted permission to approach, but warned of watchers and weapons ready to defend the Redstone territory. It was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply cautious in the way that survival demanded when strangers approached in desperate times. The Redstone cave system was impressive, a series of interconnected chambers that could shelter twice as many people as the grey stone band's single cavern. But as Nara and her companions were escorted deeper into the mountain, she noticed signs that suggested their host's situation was more precarious than their comfortable surroundings implied. The fires burned lower than efficiency demanded, conserving fuel that should have been abundant. The people they passed looked lean in a way that spoke of careful rationing rather than recent successful hunts. Korak, the Redstone leader, was a man of perhaps 40 winters whose massive frame had been carved lean by recent hardship. Scars covered his arms and chest like a map of violent encounters survived, and his deep-set eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had learned to see opportunity and threat in equal measure. He received them in the main chamber, surrounded by his most trusted hunters and advisors, a show of strength that also revealed their numbers and preparedness. Nara of the Grey Stone people, Korak's voice rumbled like distant thunder as he acknowledged her presence. Word has reached us of Grok's death and your unusual elevation to leadership. You come to us in winter's heart, with only 2 companions. This speaks either of great confidence or great desperation. The directness of his challenge was both refreshing and dangerous. Nara chose honesty over diplomacy, understanding that any deception would be quickly exposed and would doom any chance of alliance. It speaks of both, Korak of the Redstones. We have confidence in our skills and knowledge, but we also face the same desperation that I suspect drives your own people to burn small fires and ration food that should be plentiful after a successful hunting season. A murmur of surprise ran through the assembled Redstone hunters. Few outsiders would have been observant enough to read the subtle signs of their difficulties, and fewer still would have been bold enough to voice such observations aloud. Korak's scarred features revealed no emotion, but his slight nod suggested appreciation for her directness. The mammoth herds have moved south earlier than usual, he admitted after a moment of calculation. The great elk have followed paths that take them beyond our traditional hunting grounds. We face a hungry winter, unless we adapt our strategies or find new sources of sustenance. Thara stepped forward slightly, her young face serious with the weight of their mission. We offer knowledge and skills in exchange for access to your fresher water and larger shelter. Finn of our band knows fire secrets that could help you burn less wood while maintaining more warmth. Break can make tools that cut cleaner and last longer than any you now possess. And what else do you offer? Asked Mira, an older woman whose position near Korak suggested significant influence within the Redstone hierarchy. Her keen eyes studied Nara with the intensity of someone evaluating both threats and opportunities. Knowledge of fire and tools are valuable, but winter requires meat and stored food above all other things. This was the crucial moment, the test of whether Nara's gamble would succeed or fail catastrophically. She had come offering alliance based on mutual benefit, but the harsh reality was that both bands were operating from positions of weakness. The question was whether their combined resources would create strength or merely pool their individual desperation. We offer what we have learned through bitter experience, Nara replied carefully. The locations of winter root caches that others have overlooked, knowledge of ice fishing techniques that can provide protein when large game is scarce, and most importantly, the wisdom of cooperation when isolation means death. Korak leaned back against the cave wall, his scarred arms crossed over his chest as he considered the proposal. Around them, his people waited in silence that spoke of discipline and unity, qualities that would make them valuable allies or formidable enemies. The fire crackled between the 2 groups, its light dancing across faces marked by the harsh demands of survival. You speak of cooperation, Korak said finally, but cooperation requires trust, and trust must be earned through actions rather than words. What surety do you offer that alliance with the Greystone Band serves our interests better than taking what we need by force when desperation drives us to such choices? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If alliance failed to provide adequate resources, the Redstone people might choose conquest over cooperation, using their superior numbers to claim the Greystone territory and supplies. It was a calculation that any leader might make when faced with the extinction of their people. I offer myself as surety, Nara said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. I will remain here as hostage to our good faith, while Thara and Morg return to bring our band to join yours. If we prove untrustworthy or burdensome, my life pays the price for their deception. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the flames themselves were stunned by the audacity of her offer. To leave herself defenseless in the hands of strangers was either the ultimate gesture of trust or the desperate act of someone with no other options. Morg started to protest, but Nara silenced him with a look that brooked no argument. This was the moment that would define her leadership, not through strength or cunning, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything for the survival of those who had chosen to follow her. The night Nara spent as hostage among the Redstone people was the longest of her life. She lay on unfamiliar furs near their central fire, surrounded by the quiet sounds of strangers sleeping, the soft breathing of children, the occasional murmur of restless dreamers, the constant whisper of wind through passages she had never explored. Every shadow could conceal a blade. Every footstep might herald her death if Korak decided that alliance posed too great a risk to his people's survival. But as dawn light began to filter through the cave entrance, painting the redstone walls in shades of amber and gold, she realized that her gamble had accomplished something more valuable than mere negotiation. By placing her life in their hands, she had forced the Redstone people to see her not as a desperate supplicant, but as someone whose courage matched their own standards of leadership. The gesture had spoken louder than any words about her commitment to alliance over conquest. Korak approached her resting place as the cave began to stir with morning activity. His massive frame cast long shadows in the early light, but his expression had lost some of its previous wariness. "Your people should arrive before the sun reaches its peak," he observed, settling cross-legged on the stone floor nearby. "Mira spent much of the night arguing that we should simply take what we need from them and cast you out to die in the snow." "But you disagreed," Nara said, reading the decision in his scarred features even as she acknowledged the brutal pragmatism of the older woman's suggestion. In a world where winter could kill entire bands, mercy was often considered a luxury that few could afford. "I disagreed because strength without honor is the way of beasts, not thinking beings who build fires and craft tools," Korak replied. "Also because your offer tells me more about your character than a dozen successful hunts could reveal. A leader who will die for her people can be trusted to keep her word to ours." The sound of approaching voices echoed from the cave entrance, and Nara felt relief wash over her as she recognized familiar tones. Thara and Morg had returned with the rest of the Greystone Band, including the wounded Kyle and Roth, who had insisted on making the difficult journey despite their injuries. Even Finn had come, leaving his beloved fire only because the mission's success depended on demonstrating their collective value to potential allies. The reunion between the two groups was tentative at first, marked by the careful courtesy that strangers showed when unsure of their reception. Children peered at each other from behind their parents' legs, while adults studied faces and posture for signs of threat or welcome. But gradually, as Korak formally announced the alliance and assigned sleeping spaces within the expanded cave system, tensions began to ease into something approaching acceptance. Finn's eyes lit up as he examined the redstone firekeeping techniques, immediately seeing opportunities for improvement that would benefit both groups. "You burn too much wood for the heat you gain," he told their fire tenders with the blunt honesty of expertise. "Bank the coals with stone and clay, channel the smoke through passages that warm the sleeping chambers. I can show you methods that will halve your fuel consumption while doubling your warmth." Brack, despite his grief over leaving Grok's body behind in their old cave, threw himself into collaborative tool-making with redstone craftsmen who had different techniques and materials at their disposal. Within hours, he had designed improved spear points that combined the best elements of both groups' methods, creating weapons that were sharper and more durable than either band had possessed individually. But integration was not without its challenges. Vera struggled to find privacy for nursing her infant in the more crowded cave system, while some Redstone children reacted with suspicion to the newcomers who spoke with slightly different accents and used unfamiliar words for common objects. Territory within the caves had to be carefully negotiated to prevent conflicts over sleeping space, storage areas, and access to the most desirable locations near heat sources. The first major test of the Alliance came when a hunting party returned with news that would affect everyone's survival prospects. Dawn, a Redstone hunter with arms like tree trunks and a face marked by old frostbite scars, approached the combined leadership with information that sent cold dread through both bands. "The River Bend people have disappeared," he announced, his voice carrying across the main chamber where both groups had gathered for the evening meal. "Their caves are empty, cold, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Either they fled to warmer territories or something terrible claimed them all." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. The River Bend Band had been their backup option for alliance, their alternative if cooperation with the Redstone people had failed. More immediately concerning was the question of what had driven away or destroyed an entire hunter-gatherer band that had survived in the region for generations. Kyle, his wounded arm still bound but his pride slowly healing, spoke the fear that others were reluctant to voice. If they fled, where did they go? If something killed them, what guarantee do we have that it will not come for us next? Mira, the older Redstone woman whose pragmatic nature had questioned the alliance from the beginning, studied the combined groups with calculating eyes. 27 people now share resources that were barely adequate for 14, she observed with mathematical precision. We have doubled our numbers, but not our food supplies. Union may have made us stronger against some threats, but it has also made us more vulnerable to starvation. Thara clutched her young sister closer, the child's thin frame a reminder of how quickly hunger could turn from discomfort to deadly threat. Then we must find new sources of food, or we must find ways to make our existing supplies stretch further. The alternative is watching some of us die while others live, and that path leads to the destruction of both bands. Nara rose from her position near the fire, feeling the weight of leadership that had somehow grown heavier rather than lighter with the addition of Redstone allies. The decision to unite had been only the beginning of the challenges she would face. Now she had to prove that alliance could overcome the mathematical reality that more mouths meant faster consumption of limited resources. "Tomorrow we begin the true test of our cooperation," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the crowded chamber. "We send out hunting parties that combine the best trackers and strongest fighters from both bands. We explore the abandoned River Bend territory to see what resources they might have left behind. We implement Finn's fire improvements and begin rationing our food supplies according to plans that neither band could have executed alone." She looked around the circle of faces, seeing doubt and determination mixed in equal proportions. "The River Bend people are gone, but we remain. Their fate will not be ours because we have chosen unity over isolation, cooperation over competition. But unity requires sacrifice from everyone. Hunters must share knowledge they once hoarded. Gatherers must reveal secret caches they once kept hidden. Leaders must put the survival of all above the dominance of any single group." Outside the caves, wind howled through the mountain passes with increasing fury, and the first serious snowfall of the season began to accumulate against the entrance. Winter had announced its intentions with unmistakable clarity, and the combined bands would soon discover whether their alliance represented wisdom or merely a more comfortable path toward collective doom. The combined scouting party that set out for the River Bend territory moved through snow that had fallen thick and silent during the night, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of white drifts and ice-laden trees. Nara led the group, flanked by Korak and followed by 6 of their strongest hunters, a mix of both bands that represented their first truly cooperative venture since the alliance had been forged. The journey to the River Bend caves took them along a frozen stream that had once provided the vanished band with their name and their survival. Ice covered the water now, thick enough to walk on, but treacherous in places where currents beneath had created thin spots that could swallow an unwary traveler. Their breath steamed in the bitter air, and the only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the distant howling of wind through mountain passes. When they finally reached the River Bend territory, what they found chilled them more than the winter air ever could. The caves that should have sheltered a thriving band of hunter-gatherers stood empty and cold, but not abandoned in any normal sense. Sleeping furs remained neatly arranged, stone tools lay where they had been carefully placed, and food stores, though depleted, showed no signs of hasty evacuation or desperate consumption. "It is as if they simply vanished in the middle of their daily activities," whispered Jorik, a redstone hunter whose tracking skills were legendary among his people. His scarred hands traced the outline of footprints in the cave floor, partially obscured by dust but still readable to experienced eyes. "These tracks are old but not ancient, perhaps 10 days, maybe 12. Nara knelt beside a fire pit that still contained the remnants of what had been their last meal. Bones from small game, charred but not fully consumed, as if the eaters had been interrupted before finishing. The ashes were cold and undisturbed, speaking of an ending that had come without warning or struggle. Korak examined a wall where the River Bend people had scratched crude images depicting their hunts and seasonal celebrations. His massive fingers traced the marks with surprising gentleness, and his expression grew troubled as he studied the most recent additions to their visual history. "Look at this," he called, pointing to a series of scratches that seemed different from the others. The newest marks were not celebratory or practical. They were fearful, desperate, images of creatures that seemed wrong somehow, larger than natural predators, and possessed of intelligence that no beast should have. Figures fleeing, children being carried, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be other humans but drawn with features that suggested something fundamentally different about them. "Rival bands?" suggested Morg, though his voice carried doubt even as he spoke the words. "Perhaps raiders from the lowlands, driven up into our territory by the early winter." Dara, who had insisted on joining the scouting party despite her youth, crouched beside a collection of abandoned tools and found something that made her gasp with recognition. "These marks," she said, pointing to scratches on a bone awl, "I have seen similar marks before, but not made by any band in this region. My mother told stories of the far walkers, people who traveled great distances, and marked their tools with symbols that told of their journeys." The mention of far walkers sent uneasy murmurs through the scouting party. Stories of distant peoples were common around winter fires, tales of bands that had adapted to different environments and developed unusual customs or capabilities. Most dismissed such stories as entertainment, but the evidence before them suggested that some tales might carry more truth than anyone had imagined. Nara moved deeper into the cave system, her keen eyes searching for any clue that might explain the mystery. In the innermost chamber, where the River Bend people had stored their most precious possessions, she found something that made her blood run cold. Scratched into the stone wall with desperate urgency were symbols that meant nothing to her, but beside them were crude drawings that told a story of terror. The images showed the River Bend people huddled in their caves, while strange figures approached from outside. These newcomers were drawn with exaggerated features, too tall, too thin, with faces that seemed to possess an alien intelligence. The final image showed the River Bend people following these strangers away from their home, not as captives but apparently willingly, as if compelled by some force beyond physical threat. "They left by choice," Nara said, her voice barely above a whisper, as the implications sank in. But what could convince an entire band to abandon their territory in the heart of winter? What could drive them to follow strangers into the unknown, rather than fight to defend their home? Korak studied the wall drawings with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message that might determine his own people's fate. "In my grandfather's time, there were stories of bands that encountered others who claimed to know secret paths to warmer lands, hidden valleys where game remained plentiful even in the deepest winter. Most who followed such promises were never seen again." The temperature seemed to drop even further as they contemplated the possibilities. If the River Bend people had been deceived by false promises, they were likely dead, frozen somewhere in the wilderness while chasing impossible dreams. If the promises had been genuine, then their absence meant the loss of knowledge that could have benefited all the mountain bands. But there was a third possibility that none of them wanted to voice, that the strange figures were not human at all, or at least not human in any way that made cooperation possible. The drawings suggested intelligence and organization, but also an otherness that defied normal understanding of how different bands interacted. Thora, who had remained near the cave entrance to watch for threats, called out with urgency that brought everyone running. "Tracks in the snow outside," she announced, pointing to marks that were barely visible in the failing light. "Fresh tracks, made since we arrived. Someone or something has been watching us." The tracks were unlike any they had seen before, too narrow for human feet but showing signs of intelligence in their placement. They approached the cave entrance in a careful pattern that suggested reconnaissance rather than random wandering, and they disappeared into rocky terrain where following would be difficult and dangerous. We returned to the others immediately, Nara decided, understanding that their scouting mission had revealed far more questions than answers. Whatever claimed the River Bend people may still be in this territory, and we cannot risk leading it back to our combined bands. As they began their hurried journey home through snow that continued to fall with increasing intensity, each member of the scouting party carried the weight of terrible knowledge. The River Bend people had vanished not through natural disaster or normal warfare, but through encounter with something that challenged their basic understanding of the world they inhabited. Behind them, the empty caves stood like monuments to the fragility of survival, reminders that even the strongest bands could disappear without trace when faced with forces beyond their comprehension or ability to resist. The mountain winter had become more than a test of endurance and resource management. It was now a time of watching shadows and wondering what other impossibilities might be walking through the snow toward their refuge. The news that Nara's scouting party brought back to the combined caves struck the merged bands like a physical blow. In the main chamber, where both groups had gathered for evening warmth, the revelation about the River Bend people's mysterious disappearance created an atmosphere of dread that no fire could dispel. Children pressed closer to their parents, while adults exchanged glances that spoke of fears too terrible to voice aloud. Finn, his weathered face grave in the firelight, listened to every detail of the cave drawings and strange tracks with the intensity of someone cataloguing threats to their survival. When the report was complete, he remained silent for long moments, his ancient eyes reflecting memories that seemed to stretch back through decades of accumulated wisdom and whispered stories. "In the deep winters of my youth," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant revelation, "my grandmother spoke of the shadow walkers, beings who appeared when the ice grew thick and the nights grew long. She claimed they could speak with voices that bypassed the ears and entered the mind directly, offering knowledge and promises that seemed impossible to refuse." Vera clutched her infant son so tightly that the child began to whimper, his small protests adding to the tension that filled the crowded space. "You speak of creatures from children's tales," she said, but her voice carried doubt rather than conviction. "Stories told around fires to frighten the young into obedience." "All stories contain some grain of truth," Mira observed, her pragmatic nature struggling to process information that challenged rational understanding. "But whether these shadow walkers are real beings or simply other bands with unusual customs, they represent a threat we cannot ignore. They convinced an entire group to abandon their territory in winter. That alone speaks of power we do not understand." Kyle, his wounded arm still tender but his pride demanding that he contribute to the discussion, struggled to his feet with visible effort. "Then we prepare to fight," he declared, his young voice cracking with emotion. "We post guards, we sharpen weapons, we ready ourselves for battle against whatever comes." "And if they cannot be fought in any normal sense?" Nara asked quietly. "If they possess the ability to influence minds, or make offers that seem irresistible?" The River Bend people were not weak or easily frightened. They survived in these mountains for generations, yet something convinced them to walk away from everything they knew. Korak rose from his position near the fire, his massive frame casting dancing shadows on the cave walls as he moved. "Whether we face human enemies with unusual abilities or something beyond our normal experience, the response must be the same. We prepare as best we can, we watch for signs of approach, and we decide now what we will do if they come to us with their offers." The practical wisdom in his words helped focus their fear into something resembling a plan. Around the chamber, both Redstone and Greystone people began to contribute ideas for defense and surveillance, their alliance strengthened by shared danger rather than weakened by it. Dawn, the thick-armed Redstone hunter, who had discovered the River Bend disappearance, volunteered to organize watch schedules that would ensure constant observation of the approaches to their cave system. "We post sentries in shifts, hidden positions where they can observe without being seen. If these shadow walkers or far walkers or whatever they truly are come to us, we will at least have warning." Brake, despite his grief over leaving their old territory, threw himself into creating better weapons for their defense. "If normal blades and spears prove inadequate, we need tools designed for unusual combat," he reasoned. "Longer spears for keeping distance from opponents, weighted clubs that can crush regardless of what protects them, fire-hardened stakes for creating barriers. But even as they planned their physical defenses, the deeper question remained unanswered. How does one fight an enemy that might not need to rely on force to achieve victory? The cave drawings had suggested that the River Bend people had followed their mysterious visitors willingly, even eagerly, as if their normal survival instincts had been overwhelmed by some irresistible compulsion. 3 days passed in tense preparation, with guards posted and weapons crafted. But the first sign that their fears might be justified came not from their sentries, but from a more disturbing source. Young Leah, Thara's sister, who had barely seen 8 winters, began speaking in her sleep. Not the normal murmurs of dreaming, but clear words in a language none of them recognized. "The voices in the snow call to us," she said during one of these disturbing episodes, her child's voice carrying an adult certainty that chilled everyone who heard it. "They know the paths to the warm valleys where the great herds gather. They offer knowledge of fires that burn without fuel, of foods that never spoil, of places where death cannot find us." Thara shook her sister awake, but the child's eyes remained distant, even after consciousness returned. "I dreamed of tall figures walking through the storm," Leah whispered. "They were so beautiful, so wise. They want to help us, to save us from the hunger and cold that kills so many." The incident sent waves of terror through both bands. If the Shadow Walkers could reach into their refuge and touch the minds of children, then no physical defense might prove adequate. The enemy was already among them, working through dreams and promises to undermine their resistance before any confrontation began. Nara made the difficult decision to isolate the affected child, not out of cruelty, but from desperate necessity. "Leah sleeps surrounded by the oldest and wisest among us," she announced. "Finn, Mira, and others whose minds have been strengthened by years of survival. If the influence grows stronger, they may be able to counteract it through their own will and experience." But that night, as snow fell with increasing intensity and wind howled through passages that seemed to carry whispered voices speaking in unknown tongues, 2 more children began experiencing the same dream messages. The infection, if that was what it truly was spreading despite their precautions. "We cannot wait for them to come to us," Korak decided, his scarred features hard with desperate resolve. "If their influence continues to spread, soon we will have no choice but to follow their call. We must find them first, confront them on our terms rather than theirs." The decision to take the fight to an enemy they barely understood was born from desperation rather than strategy, but alternatives seemed increasingly limited. As dawn approached through storm clouds heavy with snow, the combined bands prepared for a hunt, unlike any they had ever undertaken, tracking prey that might not be entirely human, armed with weapons that might prove useless, following tracks that led into mysteries deeper than the winter cold that sought to claim them all. Outside their refuge, something moved through the blizzard with inhuman grace, patient and confident in its approach. The Shadow Walkers had found them at last, and the final test of their alliance would be written in blood and dreams across the frozen mountain landscape. The hunting party that ventured into the howling blizzard consisted of 12 of their strongest and most experienced fighters, but Nara understood that strength might prove meaningless against an enemy that could bend minds to its will. She led them through snow that cut like knives, following tracks that seemed to appear and disappear, according to some logic that defied normal understanding of how footprints were made and preserved. Korak moved beside her, his massive frame cutting a path through drifts that would have stopped smaller hunters. But even his legendary endurance was being tested by conditions that seemed designed to drain their strength before any confrontation began. Behind them, the combined redstone and greystone hunters struggled forward in single file, their faces wrapped against the cutting wind, their weapons clutched with hands that grew numb despite thick hide gloves. "The tracks lead toward the old stone circle," observed Jorik, whose tracking skills had never failed him in 2 decades of hunting. But his voice carried uncertainty that spoke of signs that challenged his accumulated expertise. "The marks change as we follow them. Sometimes human feet, sometimes something else, sometimes nothing at all where logic says there should be clear prints." The stone circle he referenced was an ancient formation that predated any of their band's memories. Massive rocks arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, but served no purpose that current inhabitants of the mountains could understand. Local legends claimed it was a place where the boundaries between the normal world and something else grew thin, but such stories had always been dismissed as children's tales designed to keep the curious away from potentially dangerous terrain. As they approached the circle through swirling snow that seemed to muffle sound and distort vision, the truth of those ancient warnings became terrifyingly apparent. The stones themselves seemed to pulse with a light that had nothing to do with sun or fire, and the air within the formation carried warmth that defied the bitter cold surrounding them. More disturbing still were the figures that moved among the monoliths, tall, impossibly graceful beings that seemed to be carved from shadow and starlight rather than flesh and bone. "The Shadow Walkers," breathed Dawn, his scarred hands tightening on the spear he had crafted specifically for this hunt. "They are real. They are here." The beings within the circle turned toward the approaching hunters with movements that seemed to flow like water rather than the awkward motions of creatures bound by normal physical limitations. Their faces, if they could be called faces, held an alien beauty that spoke of intelligence vast and ancient, but also utterly indifferent to the struggles of lesser creatures. When they spoke, their words bypassed the ears entirely, appearing directly within the minds of those who heard them. "You have come to us as we knew you would," the voice said, carrying harmonies that no human throat could produce. "The children have prepared your hearts to receive our gifts. Why do you carry weapons against those who offer salvation from the hunger and cold that claims so many of your kind?" Nara felt the terrible pull of those words, the seductive promise of escape from the endless struggle that defined their existence. Around her, some of the hunters began to lower their weapons, their eyes growing distant as they contemplated offers that seemed too wonderful to refuse. But she had not survived 32 brutal winters by accepting easy solutions to difficult problems. "What happened to the River Bend people?" she demanded, forcing her voice to carry, despite the psychic pressure that sought to silence her questions. "Where are those who followed your promises before us?" The shadow walker that seemed to serve as their speaker gestured toward the center of the stone circle, where forms that might once have been human knelt in perfect stillness. The Riverbend people were there, but transformed into something that retained human shape while possessing the same otherworldly quality as their captors. Their eyes held intelligence, but no recognition, awareness without identity. "They have been elevated beyond the concerns of mortal flesh," the being explained with the patience of something that measured time in centuries rather than seasons. "No longer do they fear starvation or freezing. No longer do they struggle against predators or rival bands. They have become part of something greater than the sum of individual survival." Korak raised his massive spear, his scarred features twisted with revulsion at what he saw. "That is not life. That is a living death. You offer transformation into creatures that are no longer themselves, and yet they suffer no pain, feel no fear, know no want," the Shadow Walker replied, its alien features showing what might have been amusement at his defiance. "Is that not preferable to the brief, brutal existence you cling to so desperately? Your own children have already heard our call. Soon they will choose the peace we offer over the agony you provide." The mention of the children sent rage coursing through Nara's veins, cutting through the mental influence that sought to cloud her judgment. These beings had invaded their refuge, touched the minds of innocents, threatened to steal away the future of both bands through seduction rather than force. "We choose our own struggles," she declared, raising her own weapon despite the psychic pressure that made each movement feel like lifting stones. "We choose our own pain and our own victories. We choose to remain ourselves rather than become shadows of what we once were." The battle that followed was unlike anything in their experience. The Shadow Walkers moved like flowing darkness, avoiding physical blows while projecting waves of mental influence that sought to paralyze their attackers with visions of impossible paradise. Some of the hunters fell to their knees, overwhelmed by images of warm valleys where fruit hung ripe year-round and streams never froze. But others, strengthened by bonds forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence, fought through the psychic assault to strike at enemies that seemed to exist partially in their world and partially somewhere else entirely. Korak's spear found its mark in the speaker's chest, sending ripples of disruption through the alien formation. Dawn's weighted club shattered what might have been a Shadow Walker's arm, causing the being to emit sounds that had no earthly equivalent. The stone circle became a battlefield, where physical and mental combat intertwined in ways that challenged the very nature of reality. Some hunters fought with weapons, while others struggled against visions that sought to remake their understanding of what constituted victory and defeat. The transformed Riverbend people watched with empty eyes, no longer capable of caring about the outcome of struggles they had once shared. As the conflict reached its climax, Nara realized that winning would require a sacrifice that went beyond individual courage or strength. The Shadow Walkers drew their power from the ancient stones themselves, from formations that had channeled otherworldly energy for countless ages. To break their hold permanently would mean destroying the circle that had stood since before human memory began. The realization of what must be done struck Nara like a physical blow, but she understood that leadership had always meant making choices others could not bear to contemplate. The ancient stone circle pulsed with otherworldly energy, its monoliths serving as conduits for forces that allowed the Shadow Walkers to exist partially in their world, while remaining anchored to somewhere else entirely. To break that connection permanently would require shattering formations that had stood since the dawn of time itself. "Korak!" she shouted, over the psychic storm that raged around them as Hunter and Shadow Walker continued their impossible battle. "The stones! We must bring down the stones!" The massive red stone leader understood immediately, his scarred features hardening with grim determination as he grasped the magnitude of what she proposed. Destroying the circle would likely trigger some form of catastrophic release, a psychic explosion that might claim them all even as it banished their otherworldly enemies. "Dawn, Jorik, help me topple the central pillar," Korak commanded, abandoning his direct combat with the Shadow Walkers to focus on the source of their power. "If we die here, at least our children will remain themselves." The three hunters threw their combined strength against the massive stone, their muscles straining against weight that had defied countless centuries of wind and weather. Around them, the remaining Shadow Walkers seemed to sense the threat to their anchor in the physical world, their alien features showing what might have been panic as they intensified their psychic assault. Thara, who had insisted on joining the hunt despite her youth, felt her mind flooded with images of her sister Leah, transformed into one of the peaceful, empty beings that had once been the Riverbend people. The vision was seductive in its promise of an end to struggle, but her love for the child who still possessed fire and laughter and tears gave her strength to resist. "I choose pain over emptiness," she screamed, driving her crude spear into the nearest Shadow Walker with desperate fury. "I choose uncertainty over false peace." Her words seemed to break something in the psychic web that held their attackers together. Other hunters took up the cry, each declaring their preference for the brutal honesty of survival over the seductive lie of transformation. The Shadow Walkers, creatures that had existed for millennia by offering escape from the harsh realities of existence, found themselves facing beings who chose struggle over surrender. The central stone groaned under the combined assault of Korak, Dawn, and Jorik, hairline cracks beginning to appear along its ancient surface. The Shadow Walker that served as their speaker turned its alien attention away from the mental battle to focus on the physical threat to their power source, but the distraction proved fatal to its control over the transformed humans. For just a moment, recognition flickered in the eyes of what had been the Riverbend people. Brief sparks of their former selves struggled against the otherworldly influence that had claimed them, and in that instant of clarity, some managed to remember what they had once chosen to forget. "Help us," whispered a voice that might have belonged to Kira, who had been the Riverbend band's most skilled gatherer before her transformation. "We are still here, inside." But the moment passed quickly, the Shadow Walkers reasserting control even as their physical anchor in the world grew increasingly unstable. The stone circle began to emit sounds that had no earthly origin, harmonics that spoke of realities tearing and boundaries dissolving. Nara made her final decision as leader of the combined bands with the same resolute certainty that had marked every choice since Grok's death. She abandoned her own combat to join the effort against the central pillar, adding her strength to those who sought to destroy the foundation of their enemy's power. "Together," she commanded, and for one perfect moment, every conscious hunter focused their combined will on the single goal of bringing down the ancient stone. The pillar fell with a sound like the world ending, its massive bulk crashing into the frozen ground and sending shockwaves through the foundations of the other monoliths. The psychic backlash was immediate and devastating, a wave of mental energy that sent every conscious being within the circle sprawling into unconsciousness. When Nara awoke, the blizzard had stopped, and pale sunlight filtered through clouds that seemed less oppressive than before. The stone circle lay in ruins around them, ancient formations reduced to rubble that held no trace of otherworldly influence. Of the Shadow Walkers, nothing remained but fading impressions in snow that was already beginning to blow away. The transformed River Bend people had collapsed when their captor's power was broken, but they breathed with the natural rhythm of normal sleep rather than the artificial stillness of their previous state. Some might never fully recover from their ordeal, but they lived, and in living retained the possibility of healing. Korak stirred beside her, his massive frame battered but intact, and his eyes held the clear awareness of someone who had faced impossible odds and somehow survived. Around them, other hunters began to regain consciousness, their faces marked by exhaustion and trauma, but alive with the fierce satisfaction of victory earned through sacrifice. "Is it over?" whispered Thara, her young voice carrying decades of weariness despite her few winters. "This threat is ended," Nara replied, helping the younger woman to her feet while surveying the destruction they had wrought. "But winter continues, and we still face the challenges that survival always brings. We return to our caves, we tend our wounded, we prepare for the struggles that no otherworldly influence can spare us." The journey back to their refuge was slow and painful, burdened with injured hunters and the traumatized survivors of the River Bend band who needed constant care and guidance. But it was also marked by a sense of unity that went beyond mere alliance. They had chosen their own fate over false paradise, their own struggles over imposed peace. When they finally reached the combined caves, they found that the children who had been touched by Shadow Walker influence were themselves again, their dreams filled with normal fears and hopes rather than alien promises. Little Leah ran to her sister with tears of joy and relief, her laughter echoing through passages that had grown too quiet during the hunter's absence. That night, as they gathered around fires that burned with purely earthly flame, Nara reflected on the weight of leadership and the price of survival. They had defeated an enemy that offered escape from the harsh realities of their existence, but in doing so had chosen to embrace those same hardships as the foundation of what made them truly alive. The winter would still test them with cold and hunger, predators and disease. Children would still cry in the night, hunters would still face death in pursuit of food, and the old would still struggle against the weakness that claimed all who lived long enough to feel its touch. But they would face these challenges as themselves, with minds unbroken and spirits intact, choosing each day to continue the ancient struggle that defined their humanity. In the end, that choice, painful and uncertain as it was, represented the greatest victory any leader could achieve, the preservation of their people's right to remain themselves, whatever the cost.